On today's episode of Love and Lies TV, I want to tell you a story that, when I first heard it, made me sit still for a few minutes just to breathe, because it reminded me that sometimes the biggest tragedies don't arrive with an explosion. They unfold quietly, over years that seem peaceful. David and Laura met when both were already in their 40s. At that age, people don't dream of wild, sweeping romance anymore. They just want a steady home and someone to hold hands with for the rest of their life. They married when David was 43 and Laura was 41. Late, yes, but full of hope. David once said, "I don't need anything grand. I just want a small family and a child who calls me dad." A year later, Laura told him she was pregnant. And if you've ever seen a grown man cry because he's overwhelmed with joy, you'd understand exactly how David felt. He said he froze in place, like his heart suddenly became 20 years younger. He thought, maybe this is the one blessing God has chosen to give me. Then Emma was born. And from the moment he held her, David stopped distinguishing between responsibility and love. All he knew was, this is my daughter. He named her after his mother, a name that carried family legacy and pride. 12 years? 12 years of morning drop-offs at school and bedtime stories at night. 12 years of small birthday parties, family trips, and moments when Emma hugged him tight and said, "Daddy, I love you the most." To David, this was the life he had always dreamed of. A simple dream, peaceful, beautiful in a way he never imagined could be destroyed so brutally. And because it was so beautiful, the fall that came after was even more devastating. Whenever I tell this part, people often ask, if they were that happy, what on earth made everything fall apart? And the answer almost always begins with tiny changes. Small things, so small that we ignore them, because we trust love more than we trust our instincts. Around the 11th year of their marriage, David started sensing something was off. Not big enough to provoke a fight, but just enough to keep him awake at night. Laura started coming home late. At first, just once or twice. An emergency case at the clinic, she said. It made sense. She worked in healthcare. Unexpected situations happen. David didn't want to doubt her. He told himself, she's stressed. I should be supportive. But then it became a pattern 9, sometimes 10 at night before she came home. No hug for her husband, no asking her daughter how her day went. She just walked past them like a temporary guest in her own house. And then there was the phone, a lifeless object, yet somehow it became a door Laura kept tightly shut. During dinner, while watching TV, even when Emma was excitedly telling a story from school, Laura's head stayed down, eyes glued to the screen, fingers scrolling nonstop. The one time David gently brought it up, she shot back a sentence as sharp as a blade. "Stop being paranoid, I'm working." That word paranoid. Not everyone understands how heavy it is. For a husband who's only ever loved his wife wholeheartedly, it feels like being told he is the problem. And David, like so many good men, chose silence. Then money in their joint account started to disappear. $300, $500, $400, withdrawn regularly, with no clear explanation. When David asked, Laura answered curtly, "I'm helping a coworker who's in trouble. You don't need the details." And you don't need to know has never been a healthy phrase in any marriage, but the clearest sign wasn't the money or the late nights. It was the invisible distance between them. Laura touched David less, avoided his eyes, avoided his presence entirely. Her body was in the house, but her mind wasn't there anymore. David told me, I felt like a guest in my own marriage. His intuition started speaking up softly at first, but steadily. Something is wrong, terribly wrong. And as we all know, intuition rarely lies. Eventually, every husband reaches a threshold where he no longer wants to guess. David told me, I'd rather hurt because of the truth than live blindly in a lie I never saw coming. That was when he decided to hire a private investigator. He found an old-school PI, a man who'd been in the field for over 30 years, with the worn, tired look of someone who's seen too many marriages fall apart. David told him everything, every tiny suspicion he had swallowed for nearly a year. The investigator just nodded, unsurprised. "Give me 3 weeks," he said. "If something's wrong, I'll find it." And those 3 weeks became the longest of David's life. Every day, he watched Laura walk through the door, set down her purse, pull out her phone, and start texting in secret. Every day, he wondered, am I imagining this? But his intuition, the one voice he tried so hard to shut down, kept whispering that the truth was getting closer. On day 21, the investigator called. His voice was heavy, like a stone. "David, you should come to my office. I think you'll want to see this." David sat down, and the investigator slid a thick folder across the desk. The first photos felt like a punch straight to the chest. Laura smiling, holding hands with Mark Turner, her co-worker at the clinic. Another photo, the two of them hugging in a parking lot. Another, kissing in front of a cheap motel in the middle of her workday. David felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. But then the investigator said the one sentence David will never forget. "David, there's something else." He opened a second set of photos Laura again, but this time with a different man. Ryan Cole, a medical equipment sales rep. Photos of them sitting close together in a small cafe. Photos of her leaning into Ryan's seat, whispering and laughing. Photos of them kissing inside Ryan's car. And even photos of Laura entering his apartment, also during her supposed work hours. Two affairs running in parallel, happening at the same time, while David was at home cleaning Emma's room, cooking dinner, and believing his wife was working late. When he told me this part, David said, "I didn't feel angry right away. I just felt like my life had been torn open. Everything I trusted for 12 years turned out not to be real." That's the moment most good men completely fall apart. But for David, it was only the beginning of a much darker storm. Because when a man discovers his wife is cheating, that alone is enough to destroy him. But for David, that pain led him somewhere even darker, to a suspicion that made him feel like he was betraying his own daughter, just by thinking it. David told me that night, holding those affair photos in his hands, he sat on the couch until 3 in the morning. He stared at the family portrait on the wall, the three of them smiling, Emma's arms wrapped tight around his neck, a moment so beautiful. It hurt. And then the thought rushed into his mind, uninvited, unwanted. If Laura lied to me for all these years, how can I be sure Emma is really mine? David said. I hated myself for even thinking that I loved that girl. I never saw her as a responsibility or a duty. She's my daughter. But I couldn't ignore the question. You know, some questions in a marriage are like tiny cracks in glass. All it takes is one touch, and the entire pane shatters. This question was that crack David couldn't bring himself to ask Laura. He didn't trust her anymore, and if he confronted her, he feared she'd destroy evidence or cover things up even further, so he called the investigator back. The PI told him he only needed a few simple things: Emma's toothbrush and David's toothbrush. If David wanted to be extra sure, he could also bring a few hair strands with the roots still attached from Emma's hairbrush. David waited until Emma left for school. He went into her bathroom and stood there for a long time. He told me, I felt guilty, like I was invading my own child's life, but I also knew that if I didn't do this, I'd live in torment forever. He took Emma's toothbrush and sealed it in a small zip bag. Then he collected a few strands of hair from her brush. Finally, he grabbed his own toothbrush. That day, when he handed everything over to the investigator, his hands were shaking so badly the PI placed a hand on his shoulder and said, David, whatever the result is, we'll face it, but you deserve the truth. And then came the longest stretch a man can live through. The 7 to 10 days waiting for DNA results. David said those days felt like hell. He watched Emma laugh, watched her run around the house, and felt his heart warm and break at the same time. Because sometimes the truth we're about to learn is the very thing we're most afraid of losing. Life rarely gives a warning before it changes everything. The DNA results arrived on a gloomy afternoon, the kind of weather that makes you feel the sky already knows what's coming. David told me that when the investigator called, his voice was calm in a way that instantly told David, this wasn't good news. He drove to the office, barely remembering the road at all, like his body was driving while his mind floated somewhere between fragile hope and a fear squeezing his chest tight. The investigator placed a plain white envelope on the table, said nothing else, just asked, "Are you ready?" David opened the envelope, and on the very first line, he saw the coldest words a father can ever read. Probability of paternity, 0%. Excluded as biological father. He stared at the paper, then stared again, and again, hoping somehow he had read it wrong. But that 0 felt like a blade straight through his soul, David told me. I didn't cry right away. It was like my emotions shut off. My throat closed up, and my heart felt like it dropped into a hole with no bottom. 12 years of love. 12 years of raising a child. 12 years believing he was the father of the little girl he named, the little girl he held in his arms from the very first minute of her life. And all of it, erased by one line on a test result. What David felt wasn't anger, it wasn't rage, it was betrayal. At the deepest level a human being can experience. He said, "It felt like my entire life was a movie. And it turns out I wasn't even the lead. I was just the stand-in, someone cast into a role without ever being asked." When David walked out of the investigator's office, he walked out like a man who had just lost his entire family, even though they were still at home, still breathing, still alive. But to him, the world was no longer the same. That was the moment a heart shatters into pieces that don't easily fit back together. David brought the DNA results home like someone carrying a heart already broken. He couldn't delay it any longer. That night, Laura was sitting on the sofa, watching some reality show, completely unaware their world was seconds away from exploding. David stood in front of her. He didn't sit. He didn't ease into it. He simply placed the paper on the coffee table and said, "We need to talk right now." Laura saw the look on his face and knew instantly this wasn't a normal argument. She picked up the paper, read for a few seconds, and her face went white, like she had just seen a ghost. Her voice trembled. Where did you get this?" But David didn't answer that. He just asked the one question he needed to ask, his voice raw and breaking. "Why?" "What did you do, Laura?" And then Laura broke down. No more denial. No more pretending to be strong. She cried, face buried in her hands, like someone whose last layer of armor had just been ripped away. The first words she uttered hurt David even more than the test result itself. I don't know who Emma's father is." In their small living room, that sentence landed like a death sentence for every ounce of trust that had ever existed between them. She kept talking, confessing more than explaining. "When I got pregnant, I wasn't sure. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd leave. I hoped. God, I hoped Emma was yours. I thought, if everything stayed peaceful, I'd never have to say anything." Hope. A beautiful word. But in this situation, it felt like a dagger wrapped in silk. David stood there in silence, seconds that felt like entire lifetimes. He looked at the woman he had lived beside for more than a decade and realized he no longer recognized her. Finally, he spoke. A short, cold, absolute sentence. "I want a divorce, and I'm taking this to court." Laura burst into tears, grabbed his arm, begged him not to go. But David's heart was already gone. That night, he packed a few clothes and walked out of the house he once called home, a place that now felt like nothing more than a stage where 12 years of lies had been performed. And as the door closed behind him, David knew he had just stepped into a battle he never imagined he would have to fight, a battle to reclaim the truth of his own life. After he filed for divorce and prepared for the legal storm ahead, David knew there was still one thing he feared the most, but couldn't avoid: telling Emma the truth. His lawyer said bluntly, She's going to find out, David, either from you or from the court. David understood. No matter how painful it was, Emma needed to hear it from the man she had called Dad for 12 years. He took Emma out for ice cream, her comfort treat whenever she was sad. David told me that on the drive there, his hands shook so badly, he had to grip the steering wheel harder, just to steady himself. Emma sat in the back seat, happily chatting about school, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. They sat at a small table in the corner of the shop. David looked at his daughter, the eyes he once thought looked like his, the innocent smile he believed came from his side of the family. Then he said, "Emma, there's something very important I need to tell you. Children have sharp intuition." Emma went silent immediately. Her big eyes looked up at him. Filled with fear, David took a deep breath, and with all the gentleness he could gather, he told Emma that he and her mother were getting a divorce. She burst into tears, asking, "Why? Did I do something wrong?" David hugged her and shook his head. "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong, but the hardest part was still ahead." He gathered every ounce of courage he had and continued, I took a test, and I'm not your biological father." Emma stared at him, confused, like she couldn't quite process the meaning of the words. Then her face twisted, turned red, and seconds later she broke down sobbing. "You're not my dad? Then who is? Are you going to leave me? Do you still love me?" David told me it felt like someone was crushing his heart in their hands. He held Emma tighter than he ever had, tears falling onto her hair. "I love you, Emma. I have always loved you. I just need time to understand everything. None of this is your fault." But to a 12-year-old girl, those words weren't enough to calm the storm inside her. She cried so hard she could barely breathe, asking over and over, "You're still my dad, right?" And David, a man who had survived many of adulthood's hardest pains, said this was the one question that nearly brought him to his knees. Because it was the one question he didn't have an answer for yet. When the situation drifted beyond the collapse of a marriage, David knew he had to face a truth he never imagined he would have to confront, finding out who Emma's biological father really was. His lawyer told him they had to test both men from the investigators' photos, Mark Turner, Laura's co-worker, and Ryan Cole, the second man. David told me that when he filed the court petition requesting paternity tests, he felt like he was pressing a button that would blow up someone else's life. But it had to be done. Emma couldn't grow up in the fog that the adults around her had created. Mark Turner was summoned first. He showed up to court, nervous and stiff, avoiding David's eyes the entire time. Mark wasn't the type of man who handled confrontation well, and clearly, this situation had turned his entire world upside down. The DNA sample was collected quickly, and just a few days later, the results came back. 99.98%. Mark Turner was Emma's biological father. David said that when he read this result, he didn't feel the same rage as before. No more shaking hands. No more shock. Just a sorrow so deep it felt like an ocean. A sorrow born from knowing that everything he had believed for 12 years was built on sand. In the next hearing, Mark was required to testify under oath. And under that oath, he admitted something even more painful. He had suspected, years ago, that he might be Emma's father. David remembers Mark's exact words. "When Laura told me she was pregnant, I asked if there was a chance the baby could be mine. But Laura said she was sure David was the father. She said there was no reason to complicate things." So for more than a decade, both adults, Laura and Mark, knew there was another possibility, but neither spoke up. Neither wanted responsibility. Neither thought of Emma or David. What hurt David the most wasn't the betrayal in love, but the silent collusion in hiding the truth. He told me, "That was the moment I realized I didn't just lose my wife and my child. I lost faith in how people treat each other." The truth was finally out. But the price of that truth was the heart of a good man and the innocence of a child. When everything became so clear there was nothing left to argue, David entered a stage he described as, "There's no emotion left to feel pain, only the exhaustion of someone who has to finish what he started." It was time for the legal battle. Cold, dry, and indifferent to anyone's heart, the divorce hearing took place in a courtroom David once believed he'd never have to step into. Laura sat on the opposite side, drawn, exhausted, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights and crying. But if you think that scene would soften the judge's heart, it didn't. The evidence was too clear, too serious, and stretched across too many years. People can forgive a mistake, but 12 years of intentional deception? The court doesn't call that a mistake. It calls it behavior. David's attorney laid everything out. The DNA results, the evidence of the affairs, the bank records showing unexplained withdrawals, the full investigative report, and Laura's own admission that she wasn't sure who the father was. Meanwhile, Laura's attorney had almost nothing to fight with except a plea for leniency due to emotional circumstances. But the court doesn't judge by a few minutes of tears. It judges by 12 years of choices. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. David would keep all marital assets, the home he spent years paying off the retirement savings he built bit by bit, the car he bought to take Emma to school. Everything awarded to him. Laura walked away from the marriage nearly empty-handed, just a few personal items and a small, insignificant bank account. But what shattered David's heart wasn't the property. It was the ruling about Emma. David's parental rights were terminated, not because he didn't love her, not because he didn't want her, but because the law sees only biology and legal responsibility, not 12 years of bedtime stories, tears wiped, scraped knees bandaged, or tiny arms hugging his neck. The judge spoke a sentence that David said felt like someone squeezing his heart until it cracked. Because he is not the biological father, Mr. Miller no longer has any legal obligations or rights to the child. David told me he stared down at the desk, fighting desperately to keep himself from breaking down in front of the room. For 12 years, he had been a father in every real sense. Every hug, every tear, every smile, and with one sentence from the court, it was all erased. When Laura finally signed the divorce papers, David realized that it wasn't just the marriage ending. The family he once believed would walk with him for the rest of his life had dissolved into nothing. If the story had ended at the divorce, David might already have been exhausted enough. But as he told me, divorce ends the marriage. The civil lawsuit, that's what ends the deception. And so began the second legal battle, colder, harsher, and far more exact in the eyes of justice. David's attorney gathered every receipt, every payment, every bank statement from 12 years of raising Emma. When David saw the final number, he almost couldn't believe how much he had poured into her life, and how Laura had let him do it under a lie that lasted more than a decade. Total cost of raising Emma for 12 years, $238,000. That number included everything: health insurance, school tuition, clothing, birthdays, food, living expenses, the family trips David once thought were their happiest memories. But that was just the tangible damage. The attorney then requested an additional $75,000 for emotional distress, backed by a psychologist's evaluation. Severe loss of trust, anxiety, trauma, prolonged psychological harm. Emotional pain doesn't come with receipts, but the court can still put a price on a lifetime of damage. And then came attorney fees. David could hardly believe that the cost of deception could be calculated in dollars, but the court deducted the $45,000 that Mark Turner had agreed to pay as his share of responsibility. Finally, the judge read the ruling. Laura Miller must pay a total of $310,000, paid in monthly installments of $2,000 until the full amount is covered. You can picture the moment. Laura standing there, pale, frozen, unable to speak. Her attorney begged for a reduced judgment, asked for extended payment terms, pleaded for consideration. But the judge shook his head and said a sentence that made the entire courtroom fall silent. This was not a momentary mistake. This was 12 years of intentional deception, and the law must stand with the truth. Laura broke down in tears. David just sat there quietly, not happy, not vindictive, not triumphant, just empty, as if justice had been served. But his heart was still held together by cracks that hadn't healed. The payments would stretch over more than 12 years, almost the same amount of time David had raised Emma. A bitter, poetic circle. And that was only the financial part. The invisible wounds? No court on earth can compensate for those. After all the rulings were handed down, each person's life split into a direction none of them had ever imagined. And in the middle of all the pain, the one who suffered the most was Emma, the innocent child caught in a story written entirely by adults. After David's parental rights were terminated, Emma was placed on a rotating schedule between Laura and Mark Turner, her biological father. But to Emma, Mark wasn't dad. He was just a man she had met a few times in her life without ever understanding why he was around. And David, he watched everything from a distance, like someone standing outside a house that used to be his. Almost 10 months went by without David seeing Emma. 10 months of a pain so deep it left him numb. Not because he didn't want to see her, but because every time he thought of her, he ran into a question with no answer. Is she still my daughter, if I'm no longer allowed to be her father? During that time, Emma had to attend weekly therapy sessions. Teachers, therapists, even her new family, all tried to help her understand that David leaving wasn't her fault. But children can't understand the complicated architecture of adult mistakes. They only know one thing. The man they called Dad for 12 years was suddenly gone. David told me that many nights he picked up his phone, wanting to call Emma, wanting to ask how she was doing, if she was eating well, if she still loved science like before. And then he put the phone down. Not because he didn't love her, but because every thought of her cracked his heart a little more. I don't know how to face her, he said. When I look at her, I see all the years I thought I was her father. And then, right after that, I see her mother's betrayal. Those two images overlap until I can hardly breathe. He knows Emma isn't at fault. He knows she still needs him. But a man can't love fully when his heart is still full of sharp, unremoved fragments. And somewhere, in the quiet space between their two lives, Emma is waiting too. A child trying to understand why the person she loved most disappeared from her world. And David, caught somewhere between loneliness and therapy, is slowly learning how to stand again, and how, someday, he might walk back toward Emma when the wounds have healed enough for him to love her without breaking a little more inside. After all the devastation, David entered a period he calls life after the storm, a strange space between peace and emptiness. When you've lived in pain for too long, even calm can feel disorienting. He still lives in the old house, the one that used to echo with Emma's laughter, Laura's voice, and their quiet family dinners. Now, those same walls hold only memories. The house feels too big, too quiet, and sometimes colder than winter itself. Every morning, David makes coffee for 1 instead of 3. Every night, he turns on the hallway light, not to welcome a little girl running into his arms, but to keep the loneliness from swallowing the house whole. He's in regular therapy now. His therapist says he's dealing with a mix of grief, betrayal, and an identity collapse. Because for 12 years, David wasn't just a husband. He was a father. And when that role was ripped away by a line on a DNA report, he had to relearn who he was without it. David says some days feel like learning how to breathe again. Softly, slowly, like a child learning to walk after an accident. He tries to take more walks, tries to see friends, tries to eat real meals, tries to build new routines. But no matter how hard he tries, there's one thing he admits. Something anyone who's survived profound betrayal understands. Trust, once shattered, never returns to its original shape. I don't hate women, David told me, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust anyone 100% again. Whenever someone is kind to me, I get scared. Scared it's only the surface, scared I'll become the last person to know what's happening in my own life. It's the kind of wound that doesn't scream. It lingers. It reshapes you. It makes you cautious, guarded, and sometimes closed off, even to the good things. But through it all, David is still trying. He said, "Maybe I'll never get the old life back, but I'm learning how to build a new one where lies don't get to control me anymore." And despite how hard it is, it's still a beginning made of small steps, but honest ones. And after everything, after the verdicts, the settlement amounts, and the divorce papers, David still had one more battle to fight, the battle inside himself. You see, emotional wounds don't vanish just because a judge has struck a gavel. They stay, quiet, persistent, and they show up in the moments when we're at our weakest. David began to realize he was no longer the man he used to be. He became overly cautious about things he once considered normal. He developed deep-seated distrust, the kind of psychological response I've seen many times in paternity fraud cases throughout my career. He no longer believed what people said at face value. He didn't trust promises. He struggled to trust kindness, especially the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. On top of that came social anxiety. Gatherings drained him. Intimate conversations felt like standing on thin ice. And perhaps saddest of all was the fear of bonding again. He feared starting something new, afraid he'd lose it all over again, afraid someone might smile at him for reasons he couldn't see, afraid he'd once again become the last person to know the truth in his own story. These things are not weakness. They are the natural consequences of a betrayal that stretched across more than a decade, a heart torn apart slowly, not in one brutal blow. And before we close today's video, I want to leave you with a lesson, one that's hard to hear, but incredibly important. Men, paternity testing is not a sign of doubting your love. It's responsibility, a way to ensure your life is not built on fragile assumptions. Women, hiding the truth about biological paternity is never just a mistake. It can destroy two lives, and deeply wound a child who never deserved any of it. And for couples, no relationship can survive on secrecy. The truth always finds a way to surface. The only real question is, do you want to face it now, or when it's already too late to save anything? If today's story made you think, leave a comment below. Tell me what you believe about paternity fraud, about truth, about trust. Don't forget to hit like, share this video, and follow Love and Lies TV so I can continue bringing you stories that are honest, profound, and healing. I'll see you in the next video.